It wasn't until moving to the city of Los Angeles where I had my true culinary awakening. Lucky for me, where I was living for the 20+ years was very close to Koreatown, where I was first exposed to some amazing Korean food. So for today's recipe, I'm taking my love for Korean food and mixing it with a dish that I practically grew up on. Let's get started. The first and, dare I say, most important ingredient in today's meatloaf is this amazing Korean chili paste called Gochujang. And it's sweet, it is spicy, but it's also a little bit savory, and it's gonna make up some of the flavoring that's in the meatloaf, but it's also gonna make up this delicious sort of sweet and spicy glaze we'll get to later on. A full 1/4 cup of this stuff. Now what else? I did talk about savory, and we have something that has anchovies in it, which is Worcestershire sauce. It's so delicious and savory, and it also has a little salt in it. So we'll add that together. 2 tablespoons. So we're going savory with savory plus meat, which is beef, and that's savory. And I'm also gonna add a little later on a bit of what? Bacon, and that is savory too. I also have a bit of soy sauce. This will act mainly as the salt, but also savoriness that we have. 2 tablespoons of this. And switch over to the teaspoons. 2 teaspoons of toasted sesame oil. Right? So every bite will have just a little bit of that yummy toasted sesame flavor. You're just reaching for these different flavors, because when you take a bite, you will never be bored with the flavors in this recipe. I'll mix these ingredients up. And once it's mixed, I'll remove a 1/4 cup of this mixture and set it aside, to which I will add other ingredients, including, of course, the beef and that bacon I was talking about. That's mixed up. 1/4 cup. We already have it here. Measure that out. And this goes in for the seasoning of meat later on. This is the inside of the meatloaf. This will be the outside glaze of the meatloaf, to which I'm going to add a bit of grated ginger on a microplane. That goes in. And we'll just add 1 more tablespoon of gochujang. 3 tablespoons of rice wine vinegar. Now, here in the States, you would use, say, cider vinegar with your barbecue sauce, but that's gonna be a little too pungent, so we're gonna go with rice wine vinegar. Okay? Not seasoned, just unseasoned or regular rice wine vinegar. Because we're adding sugar, granulated sugar, we'll go with 2 tablespoons of this. Okay? 1, 2. We'll mix all of this together. Just give this a quick stir until it's well combined, and later on we will reduce this to a glaze, but for now, we'll just set it aside. It's time to get started on the actual meatloaf itself. First order is bacon. Bacon makes everything better, but frozen bacon, okay? So what I did is I took a 1/4 pound of bacon, it's frozen, cut it up into small cubes. Now it's frozen because if you try to do room temperature bacon, it would just, the fat would smear, and we don't want that. We want it to pulverize into tiny little uniform pieces, okay? I'm gonna pulse it. Don't process it, just pulse it until those little pieces appear. Now, sometimes you might get a piece of bacon that's frozen stuck on the end of the blade. That's okay, just remove that and get back down to business. All right, here we go. Yeah, that looks good. Let me show you what I'm looking for here. All right, that is what I'm looking for. Pulverized pieces, they're very small, so when you mix it with the beef, it'll mix in beautifully. But you also want to work fast and keep it nice and cold. So this goes into the original container. Now this goes back in the fridge to keep it cold while we continue. I'm not sure about you, but when I pull the food processor out, I'm gonna use it as many times as possible. Boing, small onion, a couple cloves of garlic, they go in. And we're gonna process this or pulse it until the pieces are teeny tiny. Once you see any sort of like onion liquid in the bottom, stop, okay? Yeah, teeny, tiny, teeny, and just a little bit of water, and that's totally fine. Now we are ready to add this, the onions and garlic, to the gochujang mixture that we made prior. There we are. So much flavor in this container, and honestly, we're just about ready to put the whole thing together. One thing that all meatloafs, in my opinion, have to have for stability purposes is egg. These are 2 eggs. Whisk them up with a fork. They go in. It's like all these ingredients are the wet ingredients. Mix this all together. I'm also adding a couple tablespoons of toasted black sesame seeds. The black sesame seeds still have the hull on it, so it's a little bit bitter, which I like. Now, if you don't like that bitterness and want just sweet, go with the white sesame seeds, toasted, okay? Freshly ground black pepper. You may think that it has enough spice in it, but pepper has like a floral quality, which I really like. And then mustard. If you've never tried Korean mustard, it'll clear your sinuses. So I'm using regular Dijon mustard. And this will also help emulsify all the ingredients and keep it all together. Wet ingredients are done. Now we move on to the bread. What kind of bread? Well, we have Japanese breadcrumbs called panko. Lovely texture in this meatloaf. Right. Now I'm not mixing it in just yet. I'm going to add some beef. I like to break it up a bit instead of having it be like one big chunk in there. And don't futz with it too much. You don't want to mush it, kind of like the bacon where you want it to be ice cold. You want to break it into tiny pieces so you don't have to work with it too much. Now, the beef that I'm using is ground beef, 20% fat. Fat is where a lot of flavor is. And this very cold, ground up bacon. It's a little bit smoky, a little sweet, and a touch of salt. Now you've noticed I haven't added any actual kosher salt or table salt because there's a lot of salt already in there, and it's beautifully seasoned. Now I don't want to smoosh it all together. What I want to do is fold it kind of like you would fold bread, okay? Just be really gentle with it, and we'll just go ahead and turn this, give it little gentle folds until it's all beautifully incorporated. There you go. Now that is what we're looking for. It's uniform in texture, but it's not like squeezed, and it's not sticky. If you just really manhandle it, it's gonna get really sticky. We don't want that. Just gently folding it is what we're looking for. Now what do? Well, what I like to do is sort of pre-form it, because meatloaf wouldn't be a loaf and you had a loaf pan. So here's my pan, and I'm only using this just to get the shape of the loaf. Now we're just gently pressing the meat into the pan, getting those corners, but we're not gonna bake it in the pan. Next step is I will invert this onto a sheet pan with a piece of parchment paper, but listen, safety first, gotta wash up. I found the best way to loosen the meatloaf from the pan is use a paring knife and just run the paring knife right along the edge, okay? We're not cutting into the meat, I'm just creating like a little air gap between the sides of the meat and the sides of the pan. And that way, when you get your sheet pan, you put a piece of parchment on it, and turn it out. I mean, pretty cool. I think it's great. So the oven is already preheated to 325 degrees, medium or middle rack, and this will go in there for just over an hour, and I'll rotate it after 30 minutes. And then while it's cooking, we'll reduce that glaze. To reduce this sauce into a glaze, what I'm gonna do is put it over a medium-low heat for a couple minutes, stirring pretty frequently until it has the consistency of, say, a barbecue sauce. And when it's properly thickened, I'm gonna set it aside until it's time to glaze that meatloaf. This is the reason why we turned the meatloaf out of the pan. It's because normally, when you look at a meatloaf, just the top portion gets caramelized. In this method, the whole thing gets caramelized. But what else do we like on a meatloaf? Well, we like the glaze. If you recall, I made it pretty thick, thicker than you may think, because when you put it on top of a hot meatloaf like this, it's gonna thin out a little bit, okay? So I'll use half. and then just glaze the whole thing. Now there's no need to panic. Don't go crazy. Really be thorough with this, because when I pop it back in the oven, it's gonna be on broil. It's gonna be heating it from the top, really intense heat. And that's what's gonna reduce it down very quickly and make it a thick glaze. I'll pop it back in there for about a minute. You'll see the bubbles come up. After a minute, I'll pull it out and glaze it again, a second time. It's gonna leave this amazing lacquer by the time we're done. One more minute will pass. And then you'll see the bubbles come up. And then after that, we're gonna pull it out and let it rest for a full 20 minutes. I know it may seem like a long time, but it's actually very important for the finished texture. 20 minutes are up, it is time to tuck in. Now, I always like to give my guests the end piece because that's the part with the most glaze. It's always good to be a good host. Give myself a nice thick slab. Oh man, look at that. It's just finger looking good. All right. Already, just from that sticky glaze, I'm getting like the sweet, the spicy. Spice really comes through, but the sweet kind of tames it down a little bit. As far as meatloaf goes, this will make your brain go bonkers. The texture is so wonderful. It's not dry. It's not like chewy. You know, sometimes it can be a little dry and chewy. It's not that at all because of all that onion we had in there. The panko actually absorbed all that moisture from the onion and also the seasoning. One of the things about this meatloaf is that it hits all the points. It hits fat and salt and sweet and spicy and umami. It's like savory. It's got everything going on. It's like, I don't know, dare I say it, it's like fireworks for your mouth. It's just all over the place until you get a second slice. I cannot wait for you guys to make this meatloaf. I think you'll be astonished, as I was, how much flavor you can pack into a meatloaf. And by any magical stretch of the imagination that you don't finish the whole thing in one sitting, there's always meatloaf sandwiches tomorrow.